This week on Jerusalem Dateline, more trouble brewing on the Gaza border. Will it explode? And Prime Minister Netanyahu urges Christian journalists from around the world to tell the truth about the Middle East. And CBN interviews Pastor Andrew Brunson after his dramatic release. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pledged to take very strong action against the Gaza Strip after a rocket from Gaza slammed into an Israeli home in Beersheba, Israel's fourth largest city. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl brings us that story.
Terrorists in the Gaza Strip launched a rocket before dawn that crashed into a home in the southern Israeli city of Beersheba, nearly 30 miles from Gaza. A mother and her 3 children were safe because they had gone to the bomb shelter when the warning sirens sounded. In response, the IDF said Israeli planes struck more than 20 Hamas targets, including a terror tunnel which crossed into Israel, and a factory used to manufacture components to build tunnels. The IDF also released a video showing a terror squad setting up a launching pad, loading rockets, and the IDF strike on the squad. The rocket attack came a day after Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman said he is pressing for upgraded military action to quiet the situation in Gaza. He said, "My position is very clear. We must deal a heavy blow against Hamas. This is the only way to return the situation to its previous state and to reduce the level of violence to nearly zero."
Hamas isn't trying to achieve any truce with Israel. Hamas is trying to achieve political aims by using violence. This is what terrorist organizations do.
IDF spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus said Hamas is trying to involve the international community.
What they're doing is sending Palestinian civilians forward, causing them to endanger themselves by attacking Israel, and then hoping that these civilian casualties will generate or garner international interest in what's happening and perhaps alleviate the situation in Gaza.
A second rocket was also apparently launched at Tel Aviv and landed in the Mediterranean. It's the first time a rocket was launched toward Tel Aviv since the 2014 Gaza war. The rocket attack was the latest in escalating violence, which has seen Palestinian rioting along the Gaza border for nearly 7 months. Karen Kayemet Israel, the Jewish National Fund, also said attacks from arson balloons and kites from Gaza since April have destroyed more than half of the forested areas surrounding Gaza. Political leaders are calling for Israel to take tougher action and not allow Hamas to erode Israel's deterrence. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Prime Minister Netanyahu had already promised painful blows against Hamas if they didn't stop their violent protest. The threat comes after 7 months of riots along Israel's southern border. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel may choose a different way to confront Hamas's violence.
Close to a different kind of action. This action will include very painful blows. If Hamas is smart, it will cease its fire and violent outbursts now.
Hamas-led riots began on March 30th. IDF spokesman Jonathan Conricus told CBN News Hamas plans events for different days. On Monday, it's the beach.
For instance, Mondays are always the naval riots, when they embark from the Gaza harbor and they try to breach into Israeli waters.
Friday is the weekly main event,
where an average of about 18,000 rioters gather in 6 different locations, trying to violently get across into Israel, becoming more and more violent. We see a clear escalation in violence in the weapons that they use. Last Friday, the most violent attempt, IEDs were placed by Palestinians on the fence, were detonated, and that blew a hole in the fence through which 20 or so Palestinians got in, and they tried to assault an IDF position. Hamas is actively pushing Palestinians towards the fence, really escalating the level of violence and trying to get Palestinians killed on the fence.
Ambassador Michael Oren addressed the Gaza situation to Christian journalists from around the world.
The demonstrator is the new missile. It's actually a better missile because in most cases it's multi-usage, and they get the picture. They get the picture of innocent kids being killed by Israel, which causes the same type of damage. It erodes our national legitimacy.
Earlier, CBN News got a first-hand look at what Israeli soldiers have faced for more than half a year.
It's not legitimate and civilian riot. The leaders of the riot is Hamas, and they are trying to challenge us.
Hamas has also flown hundreds of arson balloons into Israel that burned thousands of acres of Israeli farmland. The goal of Hamas is to infiltrate into Israeli border communities to attack Israeli civilians.
It should be very clear to our enemies that there is a limit to the amount of violence that can be tolerated, to the amount of terror that is inflicted upon Israeli civilians. And of course, IDF has the tools and the capabilities to defend against us.
New disturbing details are emerging in the case of missing Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Intelligence officials are reportedly becoming more and more convinced the Saudi crown prince was involved in his death. This as critics of President Trump accuse him of giving cover to the Saudis. CBN's Jenna Browder brings us the story from Washington.
New grim details are coming out about what happened to Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. This as President Trump gets ready to be briefed by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo today, who just returned home from Turkey. One of his closest friends says Khashoggi was killed in a barbaric way. The New York Times reports Turkish authorities say audio recordings indicate a hit squad beheaded and dismembered Khashoggi. And U.S. intelligence officials say evidence points to the Crown Prince's involvement, noting that some members of the team serve on his security detail.
They're an ally and they're a tremendous purchaser of not only military equipment, but other things.
President Trump says the prince and Saudi king both deny having any knowledge about what happened to Khashoggi. But others have their doubts, including Khalil Jashan, another friend of Khashoggi's.
Everything is possible in politics and in a chaotic situation, and apparently there is an element of chaos in governing in Saudi Arabia at this time. But I would say it's a far-fetched assumption because the governing process is a very vertical one. It always goes up to the top.
The Crown Prince is heir to the throne and has been credited with bringing some positive changes to Saudi Arabia.
Since becoming Crown Prince, Ben Salman has positioned himself as the champion of modernization. He has ushered in a host of economic and social reforms. He's allowed, for example, women to drive for the first time. They can also open their own businesses.
CBN News international correspondent George Thomas says while the Crown Prince has helped to modernize Saudi Arabia, he's also ruled with a heavy hand.
He's clamped down on critics, arresting dozens of prominent business leaders, government officials, human rights activists, and even members of the royal family. The number of executions in the kingdom has steeply increased.
The president insists he's not giving cover to the Saudis and wants to hold off on judgment before the full story is known.
I want to find out what happened, where is the fault, and we will probably know that by the end of the week.
The Washington Post has published its final op-ed written by Khashoggi that says the Arab world needs more freedom of expression. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Coming up, after more than 2 years in prison and house arrest, Pastor Andrew Brunson is free. Hear what he has to say about his ordeal. Just a week after he was freed from a 2-year confinement in Turkey for his faith, Pastor Andrew Brunson appeared on CBN's 700 Club. He also sat down with CBN News' Gary Lane to talk about his experience in prison.
Pastor Brunson, it's so good to have you here with us and to see you back home in the United States. Many Christians were praying for you, and you were in house arrest. And then within 24 hours, you were in the United States, sitting in the Oval Office with the President of the United States. How did that feel?
Well, it's kind of a Joseph situation. Actually, I was just a week ago standing in a Turkish courtroom, and it became apparent suddenly that they were going to convict me. We did not know what was going to happen, but it was clear they had decided to convict me. And I didn't know
how many years they would give me at that time and how it would escalate things politically, how many years I'd end up in prison. And within 24 hours, and after I was convicted as a terrorist in Turkey, I'm officially convicted now, but released for time served, and then within 24 hours to be able to visit the White House and pray with the president. It's a Joseph type situation from the prison up to the White House. Amazing.
Out of all the places in the world you and your wife could have ended up, why Turkey?
Well, we didn't originally plan to go there, but our mission at the time asked us to go, and we said, okay. But as we stayed there, we realized that, we developed a real love for the country. God put it in our hearts. But one very good reason to be there is it is the largest unevangelized country in the world. So it has very few believers from a Turkish background. And so this was what I think kept us there for many years, is just sowing into that land, sowing into what we believe is a great harvest that is going to come there.
And 3 months after the coup attempt against the president and his government, you're arrested and you're put in solitary confinement. What was that like?
Well, first I was for 13 days with my wife, and we were kept together in a detention center. And after that, I was transferred on my own. My wife was released after 13 days. And I think that was helpful for me to be arrested with her and go through those first days with her, because we both went through a process of fear. We didn't know what was going to happen to us. And then when she was released, I knew that she would be fighting for me. One of the big concerns that people have when they're in prison, especially political prisoners or for reasons of persecution, is that they'll be forgotten. And I knew that my wife would not allow that to happen, that she would fight for me. Being in solitary confinement was very, very difficult, especially for a long time. I didn't have a Bible, there were no books, it was just a bed, and that was it. And so I had nothing to do throughout the entire day. And actually what really saved me there is somehow a booklet by Mike Bickle. Somebody got it into me, which we were not allowed to have books, but someone got that into me, and it was just some prayer points. And that helped me to keep my sanity. I just began to pray through that, and I'd pace back and forth across that room for hours, just praying through these prayer points, crying out to God.
And before this interview, you were telling me how you started dancing before the Lord. Tell me how that came about.
Well, I read a book by Richard Wurmbrand where he describes how when he was in solitary confinement, that God says, Jesus said actually, blessed are you when people persecute you and revile you, falsely say all kinds of evil things about you. Rejoice and be glad, exceedingly glad actually. And Wurmbrand danced before the Lord in obedience to this. And I thought, well, I don't feel joy, I don't sense joy right now, but I'm going to dance before the Lord as Wurmbrand did, as a sacrifice of praise. So it was one of the steps I took. That was into my second year when God started to rebuild my strength. So every day I would take 5 minutes and just dance before the Lord and sing those verses from Matthew 5, 10, and 11. And I would say, I dance before you as Wurmbrand danced before you. Here's my sacrifice of praise.
Up next, we'll have more on that interview with Pastor Andrew Brunson. As we promised, here's the second part of that interview with Pastor Brunson, whose story of faith under fire was heard around the world.
Did you say the first year was a tough year for you, and then God took you to a new level?
The first year, I was really broken in a way that I hadn't imagined that I could be. I thought I was stronger than that because we'd gone through some difficulties in Turkey. And this was very unexpected, and I think what I had expected from reading biographies was that prison wouldn't be that difficult. It would just be a time of great intimacy with God and joy and rejoicing in suffering. And it was not that way for me. I was really broken. And then it was in the second year that God began to rebuild me. I could think of several of my friends. I thought they would do so much better in this situation. They're prayer warriors, they're intercessors. They would just spend all their time praying. And I said a number of times, God, you got the wrong man. You chose the wrong man for this. This is a mistake because I'm so weak. So he allowed me to be broken. I believe God allowed this. But then he began to rebuild me in the second year.
What did you pray at that time?
Sometimes my prayers were not very deep. They were just heartfelt and very simple. And when I was returned for a few days to solitary confinement when my trial started at a prison where I had some traumatic experiences, and I started to really fall apart again. But then I found that what spontaneously came from me, even I was just weeping and weeping in solitary confinement again. And I was just saying, I love you, Jesus. And this was my heart. It was a time, very difficult time, but just a time of hanging on to him and making declarations that he loves me and is faithful and is good and true, even when I don't feel it or see it.
And he was there.
He was there.
Did he lead you to share the gospel with any of your cellmates?
I certainly tried. One of the things is that my cellmates were all, I was in a cell for terrorists, Islamist terrorists, at least called that by the Turkish government, for the Fethullah Gülen movement. And so they were all very strong Muslims. And it's basically a Muslim missionary society, you could say, Muslim missionary movement. So they were telling me about Islam. And I would answer back and I explained Christianity to them. But it was like being in a Muslim house of prayer. It was very intense. Muslim prayers going on all the time, recitation of the Quran.
Did they mistreat you?
No, they didn't. The prisoners were actually, they were in the same situation I was in. They were in prison. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. And they were not bad. No.
So now that you're free, looking back on this experience, how did it change your faith, Andrew?
You know, I was just convicted a week ago. So I haven't begun to process what God has done in me. I think that there are some profound changes in me. And one simple thing I think is that I've learned just to press on and hang on, whatever my feelings are. That make declarations about God's faithfulness to me even when I don't feel it. So those are some of the big things. I think that my main prayer became, God, I want to serve your purposes. And if serving your purpose requires me to remain in prison, I can't do it. I feel weak and broken. But then I ask you to give me the strength and perseverance and courage of Jesus to just pour it out into me so that I can finish the race well.
How can we and other people who see this interview pray for you? What should we pray?
Well, first, we're grateful for all the people who did pray for us. It's just an amazing thing. We can't believe it. And those prayers really sustained us. And I believe that far beyond us, that they are an overflow that will go into Turkey and the Middle East, and that God will use these prayers for his purposes there. As for now, we're just seeking God to say, what's next? We've been missionaries for many years. Our heart is to reach the lost, and so we want to continue doing that for the rest of our lives.
Still ahead, the Israeli government invites Christian journalists to come and see Israel on its 70th anniversary. The Israeli government invited Christian journalists from around the world to see for themselves what the country is all about. Take a look at what government officials and participants had to say.
You are ambassadors of truth. You're not merely the greatest ambassadors that Israel has around the world, you're champions of truth.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke to Christian journalists at the Second Christian Media Summit in Jerusalem. More than 180 journalists, broadcasters, publishers, and communicators from some 30 nations gathered here for the 3-day event called 70 Years of Israel. Among the speakers, U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman, who is an Orthodox Jew.
But while I do not observe, in a religious sense, the teachings of the New Testament, I'm quite fond of many of its insights and what it has to say. None more so than the statement from the book of John, chapter 8, verse 32. It says, "Then you will know the truth, and the truth shall set you free."
Participants heard from Israeli government, military, and other leaders about Israel's achievements and challenges facing the Jewish state in the international and media arenas. Nitzan Hen heads the government press office that sponsored the event.
We need your Christian media because we know exactly that you love us from the bottom of your heart, and you don't need to pretend.
Author Joel Rosenberg said the fact that Israel hosted such an event shows how much it values Christian reporting.
And it's encouraging to see that the government of Israel realizes that Christian journalists are people that at least are willing to consider their perspective and in fact communicate a fair picture of what's going on.
Participants said the summit was important to their understanding of Israel.
We're hearing a lot of fresh, primary source news, and that's what a good journalist should want.
There's such a wonderfully diverse community here, and I think sometimes in the evangelical community, we don't grasp that about Israel. So it's a tapestry.
You read about things in the news, but when you come here and you hear all of these speakers, and then you understand really from all these different perspectives of what's happening in this land and the media bias, the stuff that's going on, the negativity against Israel, and you hear the truth of what's happening in this land firsthand, it really opens up your eyes to everything that's going on here.
Israeli President Reuven Rivlin summed up Israeli sentiments.
Dear friends, thank you. Thank you again for coming to Jerusalem. Please take home with you a message of peace from the Holy Land and a love for Israel. Even more importantly, come back soon.
Well, it was exciting to have journalists from around the world come here to Jerusalem, and also exciting to see that Pastor Andrew Brunson has been freed. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.